So I am thrilled. One of the great advantages of organizing a conference is you get to invite your heroes. I am thrilled to welcome Dr. Hahrie Han. She is the inaugural director of the SNF Agora Institute, the political and faculty director at the P3 Research Lab at Johns Hopkins University. She's an award-winning author of 5 books and numerous scholarly articles, and she's the only person that I know who has been published both by the American Political Science Review and the Journal of the American Medical Association. And not to mention the New York Times, the Washington Post, too many other journals and publications to mention here. Dr. Han was named the 2022 Social Innovation Thought Leader of the Year by the World Economic Forum's Schwab's Foundation, and delivered the Tanner Lecture at the Harvard University just last year in 2024. When I first encountered Dr. Han's work over 10 years ago, when I read a short report that she authored for the Ford Foundation titled "A Program Review for the Promoting Electoral Reform and Democratic Participation Initiative." Now, beneath this riveting title was a simple and powerful framework to understand the work of democratic participation, something all of us here are deeply committed to. It was asked us to consider how do we make participation possible, probable, and powerful. That framing has guided our work at the Exchange since our founding in 2017 and continues to guide our work now in this fraught moment. It is, in fact, required reading for all new staff within our little unit, and I would highly recommend it to everyone here. It is searchable and findable on the internet still. But with that framing, so for those of you who don't know, I sort of developed my political background and initial experience in the United States as an American, but coming to Canada has been a bit of a journey and a revelation. And it is also really valuable to remember that here, political participation for most people is possible. Our election management bodies work very hard to reduce barriers to voting, and Canadians take for granted things like automatic and same-day voter registration that my American friends and family can only dream of. But despite these efforts, almost a third of Canadians didn't vote in the most recent federal election, and we are seeing record low turnout in many recent provincial and municipal elections. Clearly, we have work to do to make political participation probable. But maybe most significantly, the efforts to make political participation powerful face serious structural barriers. And tomorrow there'll be more conversations around that during conversations on the barriers, including the role of political parties. And as we look at how our democratic institutions are formed, we need to look at how our democratic institutions support and foster democratic participation that is powerful. So these are the challenges that keep me awake at night, and is why I'm thrilled that when I learned that Dr. Han had a new book. Her latest book, Undivided, was named to the New York Times list of 100 notable books of the year in 2024, and the New Yorker's list of recommended books for 2024. And it is a political science book that is, in fact, a page-turner. It is beautifully written, and I really did not want to put it down because you engrossed in the stories of people. It tells the very powerful stories through people. It is also, given what else I know about Dr. Han's work, it was not unexpectedly full of insights and wisdom, but the topic was also not at all what I expected. So you should take a minute, and I meant to bring it up as a prop, and I did not have my prop of the book. Okay, can I steal? Yes. Here's the book, and do we have the slide with the? Yes, and if you can order it, and here I'll even move this aside. You can look at the QR code, and you can order it now, which you should all go do. I would never tell you to get on your phones during the session, but in this, make an exception. But we will get into that, and I'm sure Dr. Han will speak to some of the insights from this book. So I don't want to spoil the ending of the book, but we will talk about what makes it unique and some of the unique insights there. So without any further ado, I invite up Dr. Han.
Thank you, John, for such a nice introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. It's so lovely to be here with you today, and really excited for the conversation. So as John said, I'm a professor of political science at Johns Hopkins. A lot of what I do is try to understand both the sources of democratic participation and kind of this question of how it is that we bring people together to forge a common life, but then also to become architects of their own future, right? That it's not just for the sake of participation that we want people to get involved. We want people to feel like they can put their hands on the levers of change. But I want to start just by saying a little bit about how I got into this work. I grew up in Texas, in Houston. I don't know if anyone's ever been to Houston, but I was a daughter of Korean immigrants and the granddaughter of refugees from North Korea to South Korea. And I sort of tell that story, or I like to start with that, because I grew up in a family in which politics was absolutely not something that we talked about at the dinner table. It wasn't, my parents were not citizens when I was born. My mom became naturalized when I was a kid. My dad still isn't a citizen. We talked about things like how you eat bread, right? Because for my rice-eating family, it was very complicated to know when you slice it, when you rip it, what you do with all the crumbs, all this stuff kind of happened. And so those are the kind of things that we talked about at the dinner table. What I did experience, I think, growing up was a sense that growing up as a daughter, seeing my parents having remade their lives after their parents kind of migrated from North Korea to South Korea before the Korean War, and then seeing my parents kind of remake their lives having immigrated from Korea to the United States, I grew up with the sense that transformation is not only possible, but it's a way of life, right? And those aren't necessarily words that my parents ever said to me, but it's just something that I kind of knew as a kid, that part of what we do is try to remake ourselves, to remake our families, to remake the world around us. And so when I went to college and got involved very much by accident in student activism, I think it really spoke to me because it was the work of putting my heart into working with my peers to try to realize a vision of the world that we all wanted, that I first had that sense of the transformative capability of participation, or the transformative capability of social movements. And so that's what got me interested in politics, but also in the work of organizing, which is a lot of what I've spent my career trying to do, is understanding, as John said, how it is that we make the participation of ordinary people possible, probable, and powerful, right? So how do we make it, people have to be able to want to participate, they have to be able to participate, and then it has to actually matter. And so how do we build organizations and communities that make that more likely? And so what I want to talk to you about today is I think I want to make kind of 3 points based on things that I've learned over the years from doing this work, not only in the United States, but with communities all over the world, which is first that if we think about democratic participation, like small d democratic participation in general, that the first order problem that has to be solved in any kind of democratic community is one of commitment. So that's sort of the first point. And the second point that I want to make is if you buy that commitment is the first order problem that we have to solve, then the way that you build commitment is through community, right, or collective endeavors. And the third point then is that the work of building that kind of community that fosters and cultivates the commitment that we want is not magic, right? That sometimes we sort of black box the work of doing that kind of community building as if people come in and then out pops the social movement on the other end, right? But that actually, if you kind of get into it, that there's a lot that we know about what works and what doesn't work. So let me break that down. So why is it that our first order problem to be solved in democracy is commitment? So there's, I'm a political scientist by training. I spend a lot of my time like debating different definitions of democracy and different things like that. And we could spend a lot of time going into that, which I won't bore you with. But one of my favorite definitions of democracy comes from a political scientist who is a woman named Valerie Bunce, who spent most of her career at Cornell. And she was originally a scholar of Eastern Europe. And she had a definition of democracy that I think is really elegant in its simplicity, where she sort of says democracy is unique among all other forms of government because it demands that people accept uncertainty over outcome in order to have certainty over process. Right? So if you think about it, most other forms of government is the opposite, right? In an autocracy, we have certainty over outcome, but uncertainty over process, right? So if there's an election in Russia, then we're very likely to know who's going to win, right? It's going to be Putin, right? But we don't know how he's going to get there, right? Whereas in the United States, we have an election, at least thus far, right? We don't know what the outcome is going to be, right? But we should have certainty over a set of rules and rights and responsibilities that we all have as citizens, right? This is why the work of election officials is so important, because they guarantee that process, right? That is the sort of underlying structure of the entire system of democracy. And so if you think about that, we're asking people to do a really hard thing, right? We're asking people to accept that I don't know if my side is going to win or lose, right? I don't know if my candidate or my policy or my party is going to win or lose, right? But I'm willing to accept that uncertainty in order to have this commitment to rights and responsibilities, right? And that bargain that we're asking people to make is not something that we're naturally inclined to do, right? As humans, we want to have some assurance that the world that we're delivering to our children is going to be better than the one that we lived in now, right? We want to have some assurance that we're going to be able to design the kind of future that we want for ourselves, for our families, for the people that we love. And so how is it that we begin to ask people to buy into that? So if you think about the thing that we're asking people to buy into, then what makes people willing to make those kinds of sacrifices to buy into that kind of uncertainty? If you think about it, then really it's commitment, right? When people feel like they're committed to the process, they're more likely to buy into the uncertainty. And so the one way to think about it is that if I am asking people to sort of accept certainty over process in order to have uncertainty over outcome, right, then the situation that we have right now in a lot of democracies around the world is that the process itself has become black boxed in a way that people are beginning to trust it less, right? And as that process becomes black boxed and the range of outcomes that people are willing to accept becomes larger, more and more people around the world are withdrawing their support from the system itself, right? So what do we do to compensate for that? Well, one thing, if I was a policymaker, is I'd try to reduce the range of outcomes I'm asking people to accept, right? We don't want people to feel like they have to risk that their children are not going to be able to survive in the world they want, right? But the other thing that we can do is to open up that black box, right? Is to begin to give people an openness and a sense of what that process looks like. And that opening starts with people feeling committed to the rights and responsibilities that they have in the system. And I think that's one of the things that we really underestimate in thinking about the challenges that we face in democracy right now, which is that the crisis that we have is not just one of polarization or disinformation or all the things that people might talk about, but it's a crisis of commitment, right? It's a crisis of the fact that increasingly there are more and more people who feel the gap between being subjects and objects of political life, right? That there's a small group of people who feel like they get to produce the sort of political choices that most people have, and most people realize that they're pawns in a game that someone else is controlling. And when people feel that way, then it's not irrational for them to withdraw their support from the system. And so if we think about this challenge then as one of building commitment, the question then is, okay, well, what can we do to build people's commitment to this really abstract thing that requires all this uncertainty that's so hard for people to buy into? Well, it turns out that the way in which you make that kind of abstraction relevant for people is by welcoming them into communities of belonging, right? That when people feel like they belong, they're a lot more willing to take the kind of risks and make the sort of leap of faith that is necessary to really make democracy work. One of the data points that I like to throw out all the time is There's this great study by a sociologist in the United States named Ziad Munson, who I honestly should be his agent because I cite his work so often, but he's a really nice guy. But he did this great study where he did a study called The Making of Pro-Life Activists, and he studied the people who are on the very front lines of the pro-life movement in the United States. And so these are people that, that run groups in their communities, they participate in marches, they attend, they lobby at the national level, people who are super involved. And he wanted to understand, okay, we know what you're doing right now, you're the super activist, but how is it that you got there, right? People don't start off that way. And he did these, super really interesting kind of rich interviews with, I think almost 100 people, try to understand what their pathway or their trajectory of activism was. And there's a whole set of really interesting findings that comes out of it. But one of the most interesting findings that comes out of it is this idea that of the people who are on the very front lines of the pro-life movement, which in the United States is a very highly politicized issue, right? So this is not, making sure that everyone has, trash service or something like that, right? It's a very political issue. What he found was that about 45% of the people, when they first joined the movement, were either pro-choice, meaning they held the opposite view, or they were indifferent to issues of abortion, right? Which should be kind of shocking, right, if you think about it, because there's a couple nodding heads, okay, thank you. It's because the idea is that we sort of think, if I'm an environmentalist, for example, and I go out and I think, okay, well, who am I going to recruit to the environmental movement? I think, well, I'm going to go out and find people who support my cause, right? And he actually found the opposite, that it is true that half the people who joined the movement supported the cause, but almost half the people didn't, right? And instead, what they were drawn in by was a friend who asked them to come, right? Or maybe it was like a working mom who would, decide to stay home with her child and all of a sudden had more free time, different kinds of time on her hands. Someone who had just moved to a new community and was trying to meet people, And so people were drawn in for a series of what social scientists call kind of episodic biographical reasons, right? That didn't have to do with their commitment to an issue. But then when they went to the meeting, all of a sudden they were welcomed into a community of belonging that made them want to stay involved, right? And so what we learned from that is a lesson that I also learned in this work that I did most recently on my most recent book, which is this lesson that belonging comes before belief, right? Which in a lot of ways is opposite of a lot of the work that we do in so many of our small d democratic organizations, where we put belief before belonging, right? Where we sort of say, first, show that you kind of agree with us or that you share our values or our principles, and then we'll welcome you into the community, right? And we say that either explicitly or implicitly by making people feel unwelcome if they don't agree with us, right? Whereas what these organizations do is they say, no, no matter who you are, we welcome you into our community of belonging. And it turns out that's consistent with decades of social science research, which shows that humans don't become transformed alone. Right, we become transformed in relationship with each other. And so if what we're asking people to do is something that goes against their natural human instincts, like accepting the uncertainty that democracy demands, then we need to welcome people into communities of belonging that are going to enable them to take the kind of risks that we're asking them to take. And I think that it is, that's the core lesson that underlies a lot of the research that we've done over the years on how it is that we make democracy and the participation that it demands probable for so many more people. And so the last point that I'll make is that, so then if you kind of, buy into this idea that community really matters, the question is, well, how do you go about building community? And this is something that we actually do, I think, know a lot about. There's lots of people who've done a lot of really good work on that. And so I'll just give you one example that comes from Undivided, which is the most recent book that I was talking about. And so this book, what it does is it traced the story of 4 people who are organizing around racial justice in the United States in the 3rd largest evangelical megachurch in America. So I know that evangelicalism is not, or megachurches is not as much a phenomenon in Canada as they are in the United States. But part of what interested me about this, having not grown up in an evangelical community myself, is that these megachurches are one of the few organizations in America that still bring people together at scale on a regular basis, right? So whether or not, whatever you think about the kind of, the faith commitments or not, like whether you're secular or a person of faith, the sheer fact of their ability to bring people together, I think, is sociologically kind of interesting. And so to give you a couple data points, in the United States, a megachurch is defined as a church that has 2,000 or more people, roughly. The average megachurch in America has about 5 million people in it. Don't quote me exactly on the numbers. I'm sort of doing this off the top of my head, but I think about 5 million people, about a $6 million a year annual budget. But the number that I am sure about is 96% of that budget on average comes from individual donations. Right? So people not only attend, but they participate actively. And church attendance has gotten so skewed towards megachurches in America that the largest 9% of churches by size contain 50% of the church-going population in the United States. Right? So the church attendance is heavily skewed, and the average megachurch in America grew by 34% in the last period that we have data. Right? So these churches are large, they take up a lot of the population, and they're growing. Right? And so part of what I wanted to understand is what is it that they're doing that's able to draw so many people together? And so the church that I spent the most time studying is a church called the Crossroads Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. It's the third largest church. They draw together, they have 35,000 people a week that show up in person. Right? And so 35,000 people show up in person, they have about 500,000 people that tune in online. And so that's a scale that is unmatched by any of our kind of civic or political organizations, left, right, center, that we have in the US. And so I was kind of trying to understand like what it was that they did. And so this phrase kind of about belonging before belief kind of comes from the church. Like that's one of their mottos, is that they say, look, we're an evangelical church. We believe the Bible is literal. We believe in a Christian God. But no matter who you are, you're welcome part of our community. You can believe in our God, no God, a different God. It doesn't matter. We welcome you with open arms, right? And so they're not trying to manipulate people because they're really clear about what they believe, right? But even if you disagree with them, they welcome you. And so part of what was interesting to me is that when I first started doing work with them in 2016, in a moment when the country was highly polarized, this was a church that held together pro-Trump, anti-Trump voters, pro-gun, anti-gun, pro-choice, pro-life. You know, on every kind of cleavage in America, they had people on both sides, including they're about 80% white and 20% black. And there is a black pastor in the church that has started a program around racial justice and had animated hundreds of thousands of people from the church into doing a lot of work on anti-racism in their communities. And so the book kind of traces that story, but one lesson that I want to share that comes out of it that I think gets to this question that we're talking about commitment is I think a lesson that taught me a lot about what it is that we can do to make people feel like they can, that they should be committed to a system that's going to help them become architects of their own future, right? How is it that we invite people into a system that makes them feel like they can put their hands on the levers of change? And what I realize is that Crossroads, unlike so many other political organizations I spent my life studying, has this amazing ability to kind of offer people invitations to action that is so different from the kind of invitations that I saw in a lot of other organizations. And so how is it different? So if you imagine that on any kind of invitation that we offer to people, you could, I'm a social scientist, and so I'm sorry that I even do this, but you can divide it into a 2x2 table, right? And so on one axis, you can imagine there's a social dimension, right? Are we asking people to take action that is individualistic and alone and isolated, or are we asking people to take action that is, connected in community, nestled in a relationship of belonging? Right? And so you could imagine there's an array of actions that we can ask people to do. Donate money, sit at your computer, donate money, sign a petition, vote, right? Versus come to a meeting, join with others, try to solve a problem together, right? That sort of ranges on this continuum of isolation to belonging. And then you can imagine there's another dimension, let's say, of learning, right? So there are some things where we're asking people, you don't have to do anything except for give us your money, your body, your time, something like that, but leave it to us to figure out what to do with it, right? So essentially what we're doing is we're asking people to kind of outsource strategy to the professionals, right? We will offer you the opportunity to show up, to give money, to vote sometimes, right? But we're not going to actually allow you to decide what's going to happen to the petition that you just signed, right? What's going to happen to the money that you just donated? And so a lot of time, and then on the opposite end of the continuum is you can invite people to take risks, right? Where it sort of is like, we're not just asking you to show up, but we're asking you to figure out how you're going to solve this problem, right? And what Crossroads was really good at doing is they were really good at inviting people into actions that were, on the one hand, nestled in communities of belonging, and that asked people to take a lot of risk, right? That asked people to take, to sort of do things where they were asked to strategize about how to solve the problems before them. In the United States, and certainly in a lot of westernized democracies that I'm familiar with where I look at the data, the vast majority of actions that we invite people in are on the opposite end of that quadrant in the 2x2 table, where the things we ask them to do are things they can do alone, where they're never asked to strategize, right? They're never asked to take any risk. And so what ends up happening is that people are smart, and they realize, well, I'm just like an interchangeable cog in a machine. What's the big deal if I don't vote? Someone else will do it. Right? What's the big deal if I don't show up to this meeting? Someone else will do it, right? Which is very different than what Crossroads sort of did, where it was like, well, if I don't show up, actually they're gonna miss me, right? Because I'm there not just as an interchangeable cog, but because I contributed something valuable to the work that we were trying to do together. So there's a whole lot of things about structure and strategy and all different kinds of things that kind of flow from that. But one of the core insights that I took from the work was this insight about how do we think about what the invitations are that we're offering people when we invite them into public life, and how does the kind of invitation that we offer lead to or not lead to the kind of community that we hope to build. So anyways, I look forward to the conversation, and I'm excited to learn more. So thank you.
All right, wow, all right. I could just sit and listen to you talk and not have to ask any questions. It'd be great. So you've touched on a lot of core concepts there. And so when I said, undivided completely surprised me because it wasn't the journey I was expecting to go on. And I guess maybe if you can unpack that a little bit more for us, and how did you, what drew you to that? I in my bias, my ignorance, think about Christian evangelical megachurches in the United States. I do not necessarily associate healthy, vibrant democracy with those communities, putting my biases out on the table. What brought you to them? What excited you about the work they were doing? And what other sort of biases might that have broken down?
Yeah, for sure. First of all, I just have to say, I meant to say this before, is that I appreciate how surprised you are at how readable the book is. So it's like the power of low expectations, It's just like it wins every time. So anyways. So I came upon the project very much by happenstance. So actually, for a different research project I was doing, I was in Cincinnati after the 2016 election because there was a really unusual ballot initiative that had happened in Cincinnati. So Cincinnati, for people who don't know, it's nestled in Ohio. Ohio used to be a battleground state. It's not really anymore. But it's a state where we had it was kind of split between blue and red for a number of different election cycles. And in 2016, Trump won Ohio by about 8 percentage points. In the same election, Cincinnati voters voted in a new tax on themselves, right? So they voted to raise their own taxes in order to fund universal preschool for the poorest Black communities in the city. So it was a very progressively structured tax, and that ballot initiative, it passed by the largest margin of any new education levy in Cincinnati history. And so I was like, as a political scientist, knowing nothing about the church, I was like, that's just a weird thing that have happened. How was it in the same election that Trump won, right? We saw this ballot initiative, this progressive ballot initiative being passed by the largest margin of any new education tax in Cincinnati history. And so that's why I was on the ground in Cincinnati. When I went, everyone kept saying well, this happened and that happened, and there's this church and they're sending some volunteers. And I was like, okay, there's always a church, they're always sending some volunteers, And usually it's I love the Unitarians, but it's a couple Unitarians with a box of saltines and a basement, and they make a few phone calls, and it's that's awesome, right? But so I had my own skepticism kind of going in, but people kept telling me, so finally I was like, all right, tell me about this church. And then I discovered that it was, the third largest megachurch, evangelical megachurch in America. And that a lot of the people who, not a lot, but all the volunteers who had gotten involved in this ballot initiative campaign came out of one racial justice program. So that's what kind of raised my antenna, because I thought, that what's going on here? Because that's such an unusual story, because I had all the same biases that you had, right? I had read the same news stories that said 9 in 10 white, or 8 in 10 white evangelicals voted for Trump, and how was it that we had this phenomenon? And so that's what led me to kind of dive into it. And so here's what I'll say is that one of the things that I've really learned is that there's a lot more heterogeneity in the evangelical community than I think is commonly portrayed in the news. I think part of it is a data problem and part of it is a narrative problem. And so the data problem is that when you see the sort of statistics about like 8 in 10 white evangelicals voted for Trump, that is true, but it's based on people who self-identify as evangelical to a pollster, which is not necessarily the same people that show up to the pews on Sunday. So I think a lot of the people profiled in this book, for example, they're deeply people of faith. You know, they adhere to all the kind of tenets of evangelicalism. But if the Gallup poll called them up and said, "Are you evangelical?" a lot of them, I think, would say no, even though they go to church every Sunday, right? And the reason why they'd say no is because they think the pollster is asking them about a political identity, which in the US has eclipsed the sort of faith identity. So I think there's a data problem there. But the other thing is that, you know, one of the things I learned is, and part of the reason why I'm so interested in churches and faith institutions in general is that I think faith institutions take the project of formation really seriously in a way that a lot of our civic organizations have kind of forgotten the work that we have to do. And that's sort of the argument that I was trying to make, is that, you know, if humans aren't naturally born with the proclivities that we need to make democracy work, then it's the civic organizations that we inhabit that have to do that work of formation. But it's just not happening in a lot of the civic organizations that we have nowadays, except in faith institutions. You know, and I think that what I learned is that, like, you know, these faith institutions weren't necessarily forming people for partisan politics, but they were certainly forming people for public life. And I think that it led to a lot of really interesting kind of differences that aren't commonly recognized in the media story.
Yeah, and so, you know, here you have this church that is 80% white, 20% black, and at this moment of racial reckoning in the United States, like, that is scary terrain. Why did they go into that terrain, and how did they navigate that terrain? Which, you know, my takeaway was that there was a lot of success in that navigation of that terrain. Not, you know, not perfect, but and so what were some of the keys there, and are there, you know, understandings or learnings that we can take away that might not require us to show up every Sunday to such a large institution? Yeah.
Yeah. So okay. So first, how did the work come about? So the church is led by a white pastor. It's a white dominant church, 80% white. But they had the kind of probably second most popular pastor in the church. That's my estimation of second most, by the way. It's not, you know, but very popular pastor in the church is a black pastor named Chuck Mingo. And Chuck had grown up in the black church in Philadelphia, and he moved to Cincinnati originally because he was going to be a salesperson with Procter & Gamble, which is a big company that's headquartered in Cincinnati. And then he eventually left Procter & Gamble in business in order to go because he felt called into ministry. He's, you know, a wonderful pastor. And in 2015, there was a police shooting of an unarmed black man in Cincinnati that sort of drove the city apart. And so the national politics about policing and everything kind of came home to Crossroads' backyard. And Chuck, you know, had not really preached a lot from the main stage at Crossroads about race, even though he had grown up in a church where that was kind of the center of a lot of the sermons, and he decided he could no longer not say anything. And so he stood up one Sunday and he said, you know, I feel called to be a voice for racial healing in Cincinnati, and he kind of preached about his own calling around this, and he knew he'd get some pushback, which he did. And he thought, you know, he'd get a little bit of pushback and there'd be a little bit of conversation and it would sort of die down. But instead, he got the pushback for sure. But then he also got thousands of people from the community who reached out to him and said, if you're going to do something, I want to be a part of it. And the outpouring was so large that he realized, oh, I've got to do something, you know. And so this sermon then turned into this program, which was called Undivided, which is the title of the book, that was essentially kind of like a 6-week journey on racial reconciliation that they sort of began to take people through. But in terms of what some of the lessons are that come out of it, you know, at first when I learned about it, I was like, what is going on here? Because it sounded just like you know, the kind of typical DEI programs that a lot of us have to do in our workplaces. And in some ways, it is like it teaches you about implicit racism. It teaches you about structural inequality. It teaches you about all these different kind of things that are not dissimilar to what we might learn about in our programs. But I think what's really different is the way in which they invited people into action, like I was talking about, the way they structured the kind of activity that they were asking people to do, and the invitation they gave people to sort of solve their own problems about racial inequality. So for example, at my university, I have to take an annual DEI course, right? And at the end of the course, they tell me, if you face these situations, here's how you should react, right? And that's usually a solution that some lawyer wrote, right? Whereas at Undivided, they said, okay, now we're gonna teach you about implicit racism, you're gonna take your own test, you're gonna figure out kind of like how you think about how you've experienced race in your own life. And then they had people organized into these small groups of 8 to 10 people that had both kind of people of color and white people in them, and then kind of said like, so now you know about all this stuff, like what are you gonna do? And then people had to confront those questions with other people who came from very different backgrounds than they did. And it was that trial and that error, that risk and those mistakes, it's like getting on the bike and falling off the bike, that I think gave people a different kind of ownership of it, so that at the end of the program, people own the results of change in a really different way, which is part of what animated them to get involved in programs like the ballot initiative that I was talking about.
But I guess so again, it's sort of this inspiring story, and I felt like, boy, that's a high bar. Like, in terms of thinking about how we can do organizing, how we can support change in our communities, and that the groups that we get to know, and the people we get to know, they built this level of trust, so that, yeah, I'm willing to get on a bike that I've never been on and don't know how to ride, because I trust you all, and even if I fall, you won't laugh at me, and so is that a prerequisite for that kind of work, or, and how do we either replicate it or learn from that?
And when you say, is that, what do you mean by that? Like
the building the trust, the community trust, because that felt like that came first.
Yes.
Before the confronting of, jumping into the DEI work did not come first.
Yeah.
The building the trust element came first.
I think that culture of belonging absolutely does matter. And I think, the challenge is that it's hard to build a culture of belonging in the abstract. Like, it's not like I can just like go pull people off the street and be like, let's create a community of belonging friends. Like, people would think I'm really weird, right? So you have to have some organizing principle that brings people together. So there's got to be some, something there. But yes, I think it was absolutely the culture of belonging that created the foundation that enabled people to take the risks that are necessary to develop the kind of ownership and the sense of agency and the sense of commitment that we've been talking about. And a question a version of the question that you asked that I've gotten a lot as I've talked about the book is this question of like, well, that's all fine and good, but could it happen outside of a church or a faith institution? And the answer that I've given, which I think is which is true, is that yes, it mattered that it took place in a faith institution, but I think it mattered for different reasons than people think. I think often people assume it's because there was a shared faith in God, right? That's what drew people together. But I think instead it was two features of life within a faith institution that mattered more than that. One is that faith communities, I think, inherently believe in the capacity of people to transform themselves, right? Which, especially in evangelicalism, right? Evangelicalism is defined by kind of being born again, right? I was a sinner and then I found God, and so it's like this idea that I'm born again. But that's true in all kinds of faith traditions, is that we can better ourselves and become closer to whatever the higher power is that we believe in, through our work. And that belief in people's ability to transform themselves means that if you sit down in front of me and you say something that's really racist or offensive, I'm not going to assume that's the totality of who you are, right? I'm going to assume that you're on a journey just like I'm on a journey, right? And that orientation towards this ability of people to change is really different from a lot of our political organizations that are often, like a story that I tell is one time I was doing a book talk, last fall I was on book tour for the book, and I remember I went to do a book talk in Philadelphia with in this community of political organizers in Philadelphia. And Philadelphia's a little bit north of Baltimore, and I'd taken the train to get up there, and the guy's chatting with me a little bit before the thing, and he was like, oh, how did you get here? And I said, oh, I took the Amtrak, the train. And he was like, oh, well, how'd you offset your carbon? And so I was like, and maybe it's not obvious. I had not offset my carbon. I thought taking the train was like a really reasonable choice to make, honestly, And but as soon as he said that, it made me feel like I wasn't good enough to be in the room, right? That I clearly didn't. He was making me feel unwelcome without ever saying you're not welcome, right? But he was sort of saying like you're not as pure as we are because you didn't offset your carbon on the way here, And so. It's sort of this idea that like, well, you're like an environmental sinner, like, sorry, I'm going to kind of call you out and judge you for it, right? Which is a very different kind of orientation than, if I'm trying to sort of, if I recognize that we're on a journey together. So that's sort of one aspect. The other aspect I think that really mattered about it being in a faith institution is that it meant that you had this community of people who had an inherent, like, visceral, in their heart sense of the value of collective life. Right, that where these are all people that had been worshiping together on Sundays or whatever, so they kind of had the sense that like what we can do when we act together is more than what we can do alone. And I think that is something, if you look at sort of the data on loneliness and social capital and all these kind of things, and a lot of our westernized kind of modern economies around the world, like that's something that's really gotten lost in modern life. And faith institutions are one of the few places where people still gather and have that sense of community. And so yes, in this situation, it happened to be that it was faith in a divine power that brought people together. But I think that is not the thing that made this work possible. It was that belief in collective life and that sort of that knowing in your gut that it really matters, and that belief that we can all become better than what we are right now, that we're not the sum total of our worst mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, and that practice of knowing that we can all become better, not just believe. I mean, they practiced it. They did
totally,
it.
Yeah.
They saw it in each other.
Yeah.
And they experienced it themselves personally.
Right. And to me, like, those are the kind of things where, like, that's like a habit that we have in our political organizations, but we don't have to have it, So we can, you're not a voter, okay, but like, you don't have to, doesn't mean you're always not going to be a voter,
Right.
Right.
Yeah. We talk about future voters quite a lot in all of our work, yes. So I'm going to open it up to questions here in a moment, so prepare questions. I'm preparing you to prepare your questions. But, I do want to talk, this is the Canadian Vote Summit. It is about voting. And, in doing this work, at the Exchange, our mission is to build a vibrant and inclusive democracy, and a lot of it is around electoral participation. And we've developed an approach to engaging people, especially around elections. I mean, we have snap elections here. This is, again, as the American coming here, like that we have an election that lasts 5 or 6 weeks is just like beyond sort of comprehension, where we have elections in the U.S. that last forever, never stop. But we begin, when we encourage new voters to vote, we begin not by telling them to vote, but by asking them a question, like, what matters to you? Mm-hmm. And then we listen. And that's, right there, trying to build on who they are, show respect and all that. And then, we say, there's an election coming up, connect their concerns to the election, demystify the process, all of that. But it's a short interaction, right? And so are there ways that we can use electoral engagement that you've seen in your work that start to build that sense of belonging and sense of community and ultimately agency that then is sustainable between elections?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, yes is the answer, right? So one of the things that comes out of like decades of research on voting, both in the US and around the world that I've seen, is that like voting is fundamentally a social act, right? And so like we might actually go into the polling booth and pull the lever or push the button or fill out the whatever, the form as individuals, but ultimately the act of being called into voting, making a choice about who I want to vote for, kind of thinking about, how I think about my action and what that means for the next time I'm invited to vote or not. All of that is part of a social process. And if we try to isolate the act and turn it into an individual act, then we're missing the kind of the way in which most people make meaning or make sense of the act itself. And so to me, the question is almost, it's almost like, how could you not, contextualize voting within the work that people want to do to solve problems in their community, right? Like, there's a political scientist named Harold Lasswell who famously said, for most people, like, politics is a sideshow in the circus of life. Right. So for most of us, it's like, I want to get my kids to school. I want to get to work on time. I want to make sure that the right lunches go with the right people at the right time. I don't leave my child, at 5 o'clock on, in the school bus line when they should be picked up. And like all, we all have these kind of problems that we're trying to solve. And so, someone invites me to vote and asks me what matters. And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, I'm trying to get my kid to school and like all these different kind of things. Right. And so, really, we're not asking people to vote for the sake of voting. We're asking people to vote because they care about the community that they build, the world that they're kind of creating for the people around them. And that has to be a social collective act. And so I think that the most effective work that I'm seeing treats voting not as the end point, but as either the beginning or a kind of middle point in a continuum of year-round engagement, so that, people are nested in communities of action where they can kind of think about what the problems are they want to confront together, how they can come together to do that work. An election is one mechanism through which they can take that action, but it's not the only mechanism through which that begins to happen.
No, and yes, I think building, we often talk about, building a community of engagement.
Yeah, exactly.
In the work. All right, I'm going to not hog all the time, so I'll open up to questions. Are there questions here? Yeah, we have a couple. Yeah, go. Yeah.
Hi,
Go
Dr.
ahead.
Han. Thanks for the talk. Question about your observation of this church, and your comment about how there's a fundamental belief that people can change for something better, but it's that better is defined as something consistent with the faith system, right? And the portrayal of these faith groups is that there are folks that are not included, are not welcome, must change in order to belong. So how do they navigate that? How have you observed them navigating that? Because some people simply aren't, or at least that's the portrayal, is that some people are not welcome. And so they're outwardly in the public sphere trying to suppress or oppress those groups.
Yeah, okay, so thank you very much for that question, because it reminded me to say something that I really wanted to say, which is that, so one thing I want to be really clear about is that I'm not, I don't claim in the book, if you read the book, that this is like some perfect program or some perfect church, And so the claim is not like, if only we all went this 6-week program that we'd all be anti-racist. Like, that's absolutely not the claim, nor is that the church is perfect. Like, the church definitely is navigating a lot of difference, a lot of challenges. But here's what I'll say on your particular question, which is, yes, if you look at the way within the evangelical, I have to qualify this carefully. Within the white evangelical community in the United States, there's definitely churches that are absolutely very exclusionary, that have taken very strong kind of partisan stands. That is controversial within evangelicalism itself in a way that I think that those debates are not commonly out in the public media. So if all I did was read the New York Times or the Atlantic, then all I would see was those politicized churches. It is absolutely true that is a not insignificant portion of the community. When I make the argument about heterogeneity, I think the argument I'm trying to make is that that is a part of, but not the totality of the community. And so what I really came away respecting from the research that I did with this church is not that I think that they're perfect, because they are really navigating very tricky questions about sexuality, about transgender issues, all of that kind of stuff. But that and race, they had this program on racial justice, but they're really, grappling with how it is that they build an institution that tries to navigate very complicated questions about race in America right now. And I didn't agree with every choice they made, by far, but what I really respected is that they, as an institution, and the people who are part of Undivided and that are profiled in the book, they continue to grapple with the question. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that, I think, and maybe this betrays my own bias, but like, I feel like for a lot of the like thorniest questions that we have about justice, about equity, about inclusion, all these different kind of things, it's like, these are questions where we have to grapple with and figure out how to navigate very tough lines about what does it mean for me to live a life of anti-racism, right? There's no formula for that. Even if there are books that say that there are, I don't actually believe there are formulas. And so what this program did is it helped people develop a compass for beginning to navigate that complex question. And so one of the things I talk about if we translate this lesson to participation is, I think a mistake that a lot of organizations that are focusing on participation make is they mistake the difference between getting people to do a thing versus getting people to become the kind of people who do what needs to be done. Right? And most of our political organizations are really good at getting people to do a thing, right? Come out and vote once, show up, sign a petition, show up to a march, come to a meeting, whatever. And that's a very different question than getting people to become the kind of person who does what needs to be done, right? Which faith institutions, because they're trying to sort of like make you, believe in this divine power, like that's what they're oriented towards, but that's a different kind of investment in people. Now, does that mean that people are always going to make the right choice? Like, absolutely not. Anyone who's a parent knows, like, I'm trying to get my kids to be the kind of people who do what needs to be done, but they're 13 and 17, and they do not, make universally good choices, let me tell you, And I don't take that as a personal failure. I take that as part of this developmental process, right? Which we accept as parents, but we should accept that in terms of the formation that we do, the work that we do in racial justice and democratic life and all these different kind of things.
We have some questions in the back there.
So first of all, thank you so much for coming. Welcome up north. We're really happy to host you. So the question is going to be a little bit more specific because Canada and Quebec in particular, we're a little bit more of a secular society.
Yep.
So my question would be, in a highly secularized society like that of Quebec, where pretty much 80% of people aren't religious and secularism is enshrined into law to the point it becomes controversial and it overrides other values and rights, what are the institutions that we could use that could be as productive and bring people together? And in particular, could it be the organized labor movement that could play the same role? Or is there anything that is sort of more effective, especially when it comes to building a common identity, shared beliefs on a national scale?
Yes. Okay, I think organized labor is absolutely really important, and there's a lot of really good data, not only on the role that unions play in helping people develop these kind of small d democratic proclivities, but also there's a study that I love that some social psychologists did on workplaces in China, right, which we don't think of as a traditionally free and open democracy, where if they engage people in participatory practices in the workplace, right, in China, then it had all these knock-on effects in terms of people's belief in democracy overall, right? And so that the experiences that we have in the workplace, as employees, really matters in shaping the kind of democratic proclivities that we have. And so the reason why the workplace is so powerful, I think, is because most of us work, right? And so it's a thing that we all do, whereas as to your point, attending a faith institution is something that only a subset of the population does, and that, of course, the United States is a more religious society than others, but so on. But the other point that I would make is that I think that if you look at the history of social movements, both in the US but around the world, is that the most effective movements often have some kind of structural base to them. And often we look back and we're like, of course the Black church played a role in the civil rights movement, but that was not a foregone conclusion before the Black church played a role in the civil rights movement, right? And the story that I like to tell is at the turn of the 20th century, so the late 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, one of the big movements in the United States was a temperance movement. So there was a movement to try to ban for prohibition, right? Which I'm not advocating, just to be clear, But it was started by a woman who she was a warrior around domestic violence, right? And her analysis was that if I want to stop domestic violence, I have to get rid of alcohol. Because what happened is that men would go out to the bar, they'd get drunk, and they'd come home and they'd beat their wives, right? So she actually didn't care about alcohol so much as she cared about domestic violence. And so she wanted to go and pass a constitutional amendment to ban alcohol. And passing a constitutional amendment in the United States is very hard. You have to get a supermajority of states, a supermajority of the federal legislature to get involved. And so she thought, the only way I'm going to do this, I'm going to go out and I'm going to build this national movement that'll put all this pressure on the states and legislatures to pass this amendment for prohibition. And so she traveled over, I don't know if this is going to make a sense, but over 100,000 miles in a year by train. So I don't know, for those of you who fly, like, get, and try to get, like, whatever status on different airlines, 100,000 miles is really hard to get, right? Like, it's a lot of miles, right? So she's doing it by train as a woman in the early 1900s. And she went around to America, to all these communities in America, and she'd go to Anytown, USA, and sort of say, okay, if you want to join the movement, right, the first thing you have to do is join with other people in your community to try to shut down a bar, right? Not because it mattered, right? If you look at how you pass a constitutional amendment, it is completely irrelevant whether or not Joe's Bar in Anytown, USA is open or closed, right? But she wanted people to have the experience of working with others so that they learned that thing that we were talking about, that what we do when we work with each other is more than what we can do alone. Right? And then it didn't matter whether or not you were successful or not in shutting down Joe's Bar. All it mattered was that you had tried and you had built that sense of collective community, and then she would invite you to become part of the national movement, And the movement was successful. Like, they did pass, there was a constitutional amendment passed for prohibition, but what that story tells me is that no one would have said, like, bars are a structural unit of possible collective life, but she turned it into one by linking it to a strategy, right, that engaged people around shared action in a particular way. And so I think the question that I often ask a lot of people that are trying to do this work of building a movement is, yes, there absolutely are natural places like workplaces and other kinds of things that I think we should do a better job of using, but what's the Joe's Bar, right? What's the thing that you can ask people to engage in collectively that you may not necessarily think of as a structural unit for the movement?
And I love that it wasn't required to be a victory.
Absolutely not. Yeah, and that's true for a lot of that. It's more that it's that experience of collective life that's more important often than win or loss. And there's a whole other conversation we could have about, like, how you interpret loss and make meaning of it and stuff.
Right. But I mean, I think I've seen in some of the work a desire to sort of take on things that we can win, because that feels like affirming and building agency, and like and it can feel delegitimizing if we lose.
Yeah, I think that often mistakes responsiveness for agency, right? So people think, like, oh, the only way that people come to feel agency is if they win. They experience a win in the system, and, like, yeah, it definitely helps. Like, I'm not saying that that's irrelevant, but that mistakes this idea that I'm then outsourcing my sense of my own agency to outside, right? And what we're trying to do instead is develop people as strategists, where they have that compass inside, And so agency has to be located in that internal compass, which can't be dependent on whether or not I win or lose.
We have another question.
Thank you very much. I had a question about your community of belonging. So I'm an election official, and I have a small office. There's only 3 of us in there, but all 3 of us have family members who have, for lack of a better term, they have joined a conspiratorial community of belonging. And I'm curious to know if you have any ideas on how to engage or reach out to those communities of belonging to try to bring an alternative, our perspective, or our version of the truth.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for that question. I think one of the kind of really important things to kind of point out about that is implicit in your question is this idea that, one of the things that we know about communities and civic life throughout history all over the world is that civil society can be a crucible for democracy or authoritarianism, right? It can be a crucible for conspiracy, or it can be a crucible for democracy. And so that's something that we know. And so I think one of the really, at least in my world, like one of the really important research questions that we have is, what are the conditions under which it goes in one direction for the other? And I think a lot of that, by the way, I think, some of the kind of data on some of the work that's coming out is that a lot of that has to do with, like, how heterogeneous that community is. So it's a lot easier for a community that's very homogenous to kind of go into to descend into a conspiracy theory or kind of descend into authoritarianism, or a community that doesn't have any dynamism in terms of its like leadership, where it becomes kind of like cultish around particular people or something like that. So that's sort of some of the early things that are coming out. But that wasn't actually your question. So that's just sort of like a general point. But then your question is, okay, so let's say we do have, that it is true that a lot of the kind of authoritarian communities that kind of, pull people into these conspiracy theories are high communities of belonging, right? And so the question is, how do you pull people out of that? I mean, this is like a really, this is sort of a dissatisfying answer, but this is like true. It's what's true in the data is that, the only way to pull someone who is embedded in a community of belonging in which they're sort of drawn into conspiracy is through an alternate relationship of belonging to pull them out. So for example, in the US, like one of the big problems that we have is vaccine hesitancy, where you have a lot of people on the left and the right, who don't believe in vaccines. And the worst thing I could do if I'm speaking to someone who is a vaccine denier is to like show them a bunch of scientific data on how vaccines work, right? But instead what I should do is find someone who they trust, who is within their circle of belonging for whatever reason, whether it's shared identity or whatever it is, interpersonal relationships, like that kind of thing. Say, hey, John, like, you're not vaccinating your kids. It's so interesting, like why, and try to draw them into that kind of relationship. And so that's why, local doctors are way more effective than kind of the American Medical Association. Your individual pastor is way more effective than, anything like that. A hippie mom in Berkeley talking to another hippie mom in Berkeley and saying, hey, I vaccinate my kids is way more effective than, sending a professor from Johns Hopkins out to talk to somebody or something like that. So the belonging can absolutely go in both ways. And I think one of the challenges as we're thinking about designing these communities is how do we design them in a way that allows for the kind of dynamism and the plurality that is necessary to prevent the kind of ossification that you're talking about.
All right, well, we can continue this conversation, but we do have to wrap up here. But this, I just emphasize that element of community and the social nature of what we are doing, and inviting people in. Like one of the most radical takeaways from me from the book and from, and was that notion that we invite people in because of their flaws, because of their failures, and to your point, not because of how they got there and whether they offset their carbon. And that is a hard piece for myself to remember, for all of us to remember. And it takes a kind of radical understanding of human nature in order to do that authentically. And so I really appreciate the challenge of that and holding that and seeing how that has played out in this story and in many stories, and thinking of the little and small ways that we can do that in all of our works, because I think to the point of the conspiracy theories and bringing people out, when people say to us, oh, voting is a waste of time, we do not disagree. We say, oh, why? Like what's been your experience? Like, what do you care about? And going back to that and to be in that relationship, because I do not think that voting is a waste of time. Just for the record here, just to be clear, I'm on the record. But I think that it is so hard not to have that response. So thank you for that challenge.
Thank you very much for the conversation.
Yeah.